Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Nadav Hochman, Associate Director of Gray Area. We are really thrilled to host tonight two brilliant thinkers and scholars, Hannah Zeavin in conversation with Professor Fred Turner, to celebrate the launch of Hannah's timely new book titled The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, published by MIT Press. Hannah Zeavin is a lecturer in the Department of English and History at the University of California, Berkeley, and is affiliated with the University of California, Berkeley Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. She's a visiting fellow at Columbia University's Center for Social Difference and an editorial associate at the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Hannah will be in conversation with Fred Turner, the Harry and Norman Chandler Professor of Communication at Stanford University. Fred is the author of 5 books, including most recently, Seeing Silicon Valley, The Democratic Surround, and From Counterculture to Cyberculture. Before we begin, I'd like to mention our wonderful co-sponsors for tonight, CIIS Booksellers and Publishers, a landmark independent bookstore and publisher that specializes in world literature, the arts, and progressive politics. I'd like to encourage everyone to please go ahead and purchase the book, and we'll be posting the link in the chat in a few seconds. At the end of the discussion, we're going to have a Q&A. So please post your questions in the chat function on Zoom. So without much further ado, please welcome Hannah Zeavin and Fred Turner to Gray Area and CIIS.
Hooray. Thank you, Nadav. Hi, Hannah.
Hi.
Yay, congratulations. Yay.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Nadav. Thank you, CIIS. Thank you, Gray Area.
Yep, and double down on that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gray Area, the most interesting arts organization in the city. And thank you, CIIS, the best bookstore in the city. Thank you both for having us. So just for folks out there in the audience, we'll probably talk, Hannah and I, for about a half an hour. I'll ask Hannah some questions. And then we'll try to have the second half hour really open for questions from you. So please post questions in the chat as we go. Please jump right in and do that. That would be really helpful for us. And then I'll be calling on folks and just kind of managing the Q&A after that. We'll go for about an hour. We'll wrap up at about 7 o'clock Pacific time. And hopefully that makes sense. So please, questions in the chat, and also, don't forget to click on the link. You can order the book. It's not only interesting, it's beautiful. So great. All right. So I'm assuming that a number of folks in the audience haven't read the book. I've read it quite carefully and really love it. It's the kind of history that I think folks want to read as well as write. It's super clear. It takes us from Freud to the contemporary moment. It's really quite a piece of work. Hannah, how did you ever find your way into telephonic and teletherapy?
Well, in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, we might call it multiply determined. On the one hand, there's all kinds of personal interest, both in media and in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, but also in graduate school, I had at first what felt like 2 really separate loves: the history of technology and the history of psychology, psychoanalysis. And eventually, I think I did a bit of an additive no duh. I said, what if I can just write this book on mediated therapy? But as it became clear, and this is a central argument in the book, all therapy is mediated. So I needed a different delimiting factor. So I decided, instead of mediated therapy, which would include the in-person scenario, but also things like Rorschach tests and VR, to really look at cases where the patient, or patients plural, are dislocated from the person or object offering care, and went with it.
Yeah, one of the things that really surprised me in the book is early on, you take us back to Sigmund Freud. And, when I think about psychotherapy in the Freudian tradition, I think that the whole mechanism of healing is supposed to work through face-to-face talk, transference, the things that happen in a room between 2 people. And yet, as you point out, Freud himself is conducting some mediated therapy early on. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, on the one hand, I was surprised too, but not for the reasons just that you lay out those, but also Freud famously loved media as metaphor. So the fact that he was also making real, lived, concrete recourse to, in the Freudian case, the letter, to both treat himself and many patients, but at least one for quite a long time, little Hans, a little boy, was surprising. The letter figures as part of pathology for Freud. But part of this, again, had to do with setting up a redescription. The first case I look at is Freud's treatment by his best friend and later enemy, which is very classic for Freud, Wilhelm Fliess. And this is called Freud's self-analysis. It's called the origins of psychoanalysis. It has this deep status in psychoanalytic theory and practice as such. And I turned it on its head and said, what if it's not a self-analysis, given that it has all of the hallmarks of analysis, but on the post? And look at the letters and how, in fact, Freud is playing both with making psychoanalysis and making recourse to mediated relationality at the same time. And that's how the book opens.
Yeah, mediated relationality, it's a lot of syllables, but it's a really important idea here. And you developed this, but you developed this great idea, sort of a version of that, right? Out of the, well, I don't want to preface it, but you developed this idea of kind of, distanced intimacy. Can you say a little bit about what distance intimacy is? And I was wondering, as I read the book, did that first begin to occur to you as you were reading Freud and reading the letters, or did it emerge somewhere else? How do you think about distance intimacy, and where did it come from in your own process of developing the book?
Thank you for that question. So distanced intimacy is the term I use in the book to describe what happens over distance, doing what we're doing now, but what we've been doing for the last 18 months. And you may be asking me later, so I don't want to give this away, but things are different now than they were at any other time in the history that I was looking at, for many reasons. So what kinds of intimacy are afforded at distance? And I mean that both psychologically and in terms of media. What's encouraged, what's allowed to be fantasized, made up, exaggerated, diminished. And intimacy isn't just a happy and fuzzy word too. Violence can be quite intimate. So all of the experience of intimacy in its full richness can be carried over any channel, is one of the arguments in the book, including therapeutic intimacy. And where it came from was not just reading. I think the coinage emerged when I was working on the third chapter, actually, the suicide column. And then became a kind of global way of thinking many different kinds of mediated intimacy at distance, but also from being a kid on AOL and chatting all night with strangers, at 10 or 11 or 12, and nothing, not in the moral panic way, but in the kind of fascinated way. I'm sure the way people experienced Usenet just before that, and indeed experienced the letter. They're not the same thing, even if they can be yoked under the same concept.
Well, let me press this one point a little bit on the distance intimacy. I mean, what you do make the argument that intimacy carries across many different channels. And yet I'm struck that one of the powers of the book is that it shows how different media technologies, paper, the radio, the computer, each have different affordances that dramatically shape the patterns of interaction and intimacy. And I found myself wondering, as I read along, what difference the body makes. When you think about traditional psychotherapy, there's a lot going on with the bodies in the room that isn't verbalized or vocalized. And yet so many of the technologies that you're working with in the book are technologies of verbalization, vocalization. And that's true even with the letters with Fliess early on. And so I'm wondering, do you really feel like the kind of intimacy that can be achieved through these different channels incorporates the body? Does the body not matter as much? Where does the body fit in your account of distance intimacy?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. And one that, of course, I think is something I'll continue to look at. On the one hand, psychoanalysis is the first case in the book, really proper kind of Freudian analysis. And it doesn't stay there, right? The book is not only about psychoanalysis, but there are all of these mechanisms in the traditional in-room scenario to mediate and distance the body of the analyst from the patient. Freud chose the couch because he was already working with one for hypnosis because of fainting. But also, why did he keep it might be the better question. He didn't want to look at his patients, and he didn't want them looking at him all day. He found it exhausting. So there is all of this question of what is the right dosage or ratio of a certain kind of embodied intimacy already. If you can put it on the couch, then the question is, so what does that 6 feet of separation, social distancing, do to intimacy? And I talk about this at the coda of the book. Some people who are adamantly against teletherapy are against it because, and I think this is really incendiary, but gives us a lot to think about, that the patient should feel under threat from the analyst physically. Various kinds of threat. What I uncovered in the book is that actually the absence of the body, the removal of that threat, can sometimes allow the work to happen at all. So that's one place that the body goes away. There are all kinds of other problems like the silences. I see that Ben Kafka is on the chat. Ben Kafka wrote this beautiful essay on media and psychoanalysis where he talks about I think it's 11, forgive me if it's 9 or 12, 11 different kinds of silence that can occur in an analytic encounter. And my friend Adam Savage recently told me that now on Zoom, there's only one kind of silence. And on the contemporary phone call, one. But on the analog phone call, there was, again, a kind of carrying. So what does that do? It's not just the body. So on the one hand, it helps us manage the threat or excitement around touch. I also think the body comes in once again in different ways. Patients play. I'm not going to do it right now, but patients play.
I saw your hands coming toward the screen. It was like, oh no, what's happening?
That's my body in play and in movement, even though it's static and on Zoom at once. And I think that the rest of this can get very fine grained, but maybe we can pick up some other cases where.
No, I'm especially intrigued because, of course, I know I'm going to harp on Freud for another 2 seconds and then we'll leave him behind. I mean, you point out in the book that some part of him is thinking about spiritualism, and that kind of,
large part,
large part, right? And that 19th century, early 20th, but really 19th century emphasis that John Peters has picked up on as well of these sort of disembodied voices going through space. There's something, in the history of media that is about media's ability to cut away the body and produce the voices that somehow reveal the truth of the spirit. And one of the things that I love about this book is that it's so material, it doesn't go there, but there's a hint under there, and there's a hint of religion threading its way through the fabric of the book. And one of the places that it pops out is in the hotlines. Can you tell us about what the hotlines were and how they connect to your story?
Sure, of course. I also just want to say for those who are going to read the book that Fred is also pointing at an Easter egg, which is there's a running theme of telepathy throughout the book, because it is the thing that is most commonly used as a kind of referent or touch point. So spiritualism is everywhere, not just with Freud, but after. Right. The suicide hotline, I knew would have to be a case. I just didn't know its history when I began to go pull that thread. And the thread got pulled in the US all the way back to the Bay Area in 1959, where the first US suicide hotline was developed in a kind of relationship to, but contradistinction to the other extant hotlines, which were all psycho-religious. They were pastoral care delivered by phone. Here, that was automatically and immediately queered because a queer priest named Bernard Mays, who goes on to be the chairman of NPR and found media studies at UVA, an amazing life, wanted to speak directly on the phone to queer non-parishioners and anyone else considering suicide. And it gets its start in 1959. And I love this detail because he calls himself Bruce and starts writing messages in the back of matchbooks in the Tenderloin, which then also became an excuse to email Gail Rubin and ask if Rubin had seen any of these as it's collected. But saying, thinking of ending it all, call Bruce. And the hotline worked. It caught on using this kind of guerrilla method of reaching out, and is the case that I think I remain most moved by. And that hotline is still extant. It's still here. It's still operant.
No, I think it's amazing. And it's a wonderful story. And I was struck reading the Bruce story alongside the history of the more church-driven spiritual counseling sites. Can you tell that story as well? Because I think that hiding in there is a really important American history around kind of the transformation of spiritual therapeutic religious therapeutic, Christian therapeutic, into something more individualistic, independent, sexuality centered. I just think those things are moving right through your chapter. Can you just say a little bit about the spiritual side of it?
Absolutely. Let me back up. Norman Vincent Peale, of kind of the classic individualist, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, Americana, had partnered with a psychotherapist and psychoanalyst named Smiley Blanton, which is an all-time name.
Yep.
And Smiley Blanton was a good Christian. And a patient of Freud's, right up until Freud died in 1939. And Blanton took his Christianity and Peale's version of a very particular Protestant American Christianity and his recourse to Freud, and began to train hundreds and hundreds of psycho-religious counselors who went all across the country. D.W. Winnicott, the famous psychoanalyst, comes to the US to talk to Anglicans also. This is a big cross-pollination that's occurring starting with the Great Depression and into the 1950s. So a number of those descendants go out into the world, including also to California, where evangelical churches begin to take up this recourse to the suicide hotline, and not just to take care of people, but to pull them into the church. It becomes a dual kind of outreach method. And so we have that all over the country, not just Protestant, also Catholic suicide hotlines. And I'm very interested, of course, in that remediating of the confessional, which, Foucault says, Freud, it's funny that Freud was the first psychoanalyst. It should have been a Catholic. Freud makes a version of the same joke. And indeed, in fact, that remediation comes through Protestantism and not Catholicism.
Right. And this is one of the things that I love about the book, right? Is that you'll, and this happens all the time in the book for folks who haven't read it yet. The thing that Hannah just did, starting us with a story about a thing that happened somewhere, Bruce, amazing the matchbook story is really great. But then underneath that is this very deep history of kind of religious transformation in America in the 50s. And it really bubbles right up through your chapter. And that's one of the things that I like about each of the chapters. They'll tell a particular story that's very anchored in narrative, but underneath it, there's this big history bubbling around. And somehow you manage to tell big history in small pieces. And it's quite a trick. It's really something. So far we've been talking about teletherapeutic modes that are, explicitly interactive. And that's something that's in many of the modes. But I remember that there's also, a radio-driven mode, Winnicott in the war, and then later on there are these, I guess the talk shows are interactive, but in a very structured way. Can you say a little bit about the role of mass media with regard to teletherapy?
Sure. Yes. So the early case, and there are maybe 3 genres of radiotherapy I look at in the mass intimacy chapter, which is again about the question of how can we all start pretending together that we are, it's the Patty Scannell trick, right? That we are the someone that is being addressed as in anyone. And so D.W. Winnicott takes to the radio precisely, it's a moment not the same as ours, but related, where distance is everywhere, not because of a virus, but because of the Blitz. Psychoanalysts have left the country's centers, urban centers, and are scattered around where there are very few patients, if any, who are willing to pay and come into treatment in the room. And Winnicott, sends out these very moving but basic radio broadcasts that hit that anyone. And he centers on mothers, which is his particular preoccupation. And from there, I look at the ways that these are both very generalized to capture, but also how very particular individual therapeutic relationships are also running back behind the scenes. So using the letter. So again, the book is not a supersession narrative, like somehow we got rid of the letter to go to the radio, then we have phones and now we're all Zooming. Although we are mostly Zooming.
Chronologically, it moves that way, but that's not in fact.
But in fact, all of the media represent themselves, the return of the repressed, if you will, for a joke. So then by the time we get to the other side of that 1950s change with Christianity, the radio has become something quite different in the US context. And all of these women who are either light feminist or really pushing back on feminism, start addressing women specifically, not so much as mothers, but as wives and ex-wives, as the divorce rate skyrockets. And it's again very tied up in that history that's going to come after in the book as well, around the moral panic of divorce, the moral panic of feminism, the status of the family, which as scholars, point out is also very much at play in the 1940s. And again, then it moves to someone like Esther Perel, who many of us have heard, and other kinds of podcasted therapy, which is increasingly a move that people are drawn to.
Right. It is really interesting. You just pointed something out that I hadn't thought as much about while I was reading, and it is the role of gender and the changing role of women in the story. The book really starts with a story of a couple of men, analyzing one another. But by the time we're at the back end, women are everywhere, and they're sort of part of that conversation. And Esther Perel features large and very deftly handled. How do you figure, or is it even something to figure, the sort of large scale shifts in women's roles in American society in particular, and the changes in therapy, the changes in mediated therapy that you're tracking? Are those things related, or are they just coincidental?
I was telling Fred before we went live that I've just spent part of the summer really thinking even more about that question, where technology meets gender, meets particularly the devaluation of talk therapy. So, in the background here is a story of the loss of the expert and his status as it gives way to a bunch of different ways to batch process patients, a bunch. So I just glanced a question in the chat that I'm sure we'll answer more fully, but yes, by the time we get Eliza, there's no doubt that she's going to be named, if not after Eliza Doolittle, so on the nose. She's definitely going to bear a feminized name and be part of this turn to feminized therapy, because by 1984 is the crossover year. There are more women therapists than men across the board. And it's already happened recursively throughout the 20th century in the US. In England and in Central Europe, pre-Nazism, it's a completely different story where, if not at the highest level of regard, although also it's a women's show. Right after Freud, it's Anna Freud, his daughter, and Melanie Klein, and other women too. So this has always been part of it, I think, in and out as things become re-medicalized and then demedicalized and devalued, which isn't an argument in favor of medicalization. It's just a description of what happened.
Super interesting. Okay, just a reminder for everyone in the audience that we will be going to a Q&A format here in just a few minutes. So please do post questions. Naum, thank you for that question, and please post others, and we'll try to get to them pretty directly. So one of the things that I found most fascinating in the book comes in the back third, and it's when you turn toward database systems, large computational systems that have or pretend to have voices and some degree of humanness. So Eliza is a classic example. Ezra was my personal favorite. Can you tell us a little bit about who Eliza and Ezra were and why people thought they might be therapeutically valuable?
Great, thank you. So Eliza is the better known case in the book. I call her the most written about therapeutic artifact ever, despite not being a therapist or part of therapy. But it bears repeating. She, in scare quotes, is a 1966 experiment done by Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT to do something entirely else, which is to demonstrate, in fact, that, it's very superficial to talk to a kind of chatbot program. She's one of the very first chatbots. And it's an experiment in natural language processing. But in order to get people, quote unquote, talking to Eliza, he puts her in a kind of costume of a script, no avatar, but as a Rogerian psychotherapist. So someone who's doing a kind of linguistic entrainment already before we have the kind of idea from computational human-computer interaction, which is to say, tell me about your sister. If you mention your sister, or you hate your sister, you love your sister, tell me more about that. That kind of parody. And that's what Eliza does. And in fact, people still really like talking to Eliza, at least for a little while. But in the 1980s, people would really do this kind of confession work with, quote unquote, her, which is what Weizenbaum, much to his shock and dismay, like beyond chagrin, discovered. So that's kind of where it gets started. On the other hand, some 20 years later at Cornell, we have Ezra, again, all caps, which is not a chatbot, but a psychologist who is answering questions from Cornell students in response to a worry about the mental health of the college students there.
Mm-hmm.
And he was pseudonymous. And one thing that's really incredible from that story is that despite being a man, everyone assumed it had to be a woman, masquerading as a man. So either you're inside the, right, you're projecting into a kind of feminized therapy, quote unquote, Eliza, or you disbelieve the avatar you're given and turn in your fantasy the therapist back into a woman. So the kind of feminization theme from the previous question runs deep.
Yeah, no, it's just astonishing. So as you read along in the book, you get to the mental health cyber clinic, and you get to Cornell in 1986. Is a little bit different, where the Ezra character is written to by a student. Dear Uncle Ezra, where is the bridge that everyone jumps off of? I'm considering it myself. And that moment is a fascinating moment. It's sort of a message in a bottle floated out to a database, but a real person jumps in, and I think that's really, really interesting. Toward the end of the book, you get to talking more about databases and about corporate pressures on databases. And on page 215, there's Isaac Johanna, I think is how you pronounce his name, a co-director of the Center for Biomedical Informatics at Harvard. And he's talking to the New Yorker, and he says this: you cannot have accountable care, financially or morally accountable care, if you cannot count. And until recently, we literally could not count with any degree of acceptable accuracy. It's been mind-boggling to those of us who knew what was available, that Amazon and Netflix were creating a far more customized, data-driven, evidence-based experience for their consumers than medicine has. And I guess one of the questions I have for you, Hannah, is can you imagine a world in which we develop the kind of customization, targeting that is focused on mental health, mental suffering, and I don't want to use the word well-being. It was about to cross my tongue, but it stopped in time. But can we imagine building systems that are as good for our collective mental health as Amazon seems to be for our shopping? Is that even a sensible comparison?
So I think there are a few things here. One is, we have to think about, is Amazon good for our shopping? I'm going to just leave that there. We're being co-hosted by City Lights. I think, But if we move, or Netflix, say, right? Like, oh, but here's a new show you might like. Part of this is it just that quote, and I deal with this there in the book. It's not interrelated and really thinking about the sort of systemic problems of mental health care in this country in 2020, 2021, which is to say that you can't customize because the kinds of quote unquote evidence-based, and accountable and counting and predictive care runs in the face of much care that many people might like, psychoanalytic care, which has been notoriously allergic to that kind of quantification. So anything related to the qualification of the self. And that when we do, it almost always is uptaken into kinds of surveillance or even just more casually data leak. So it seems that over and over again, these teletherapy corporate companies suffer from this kind of inability to safeguard even the most basic of data. And now, most recently, it wasn't so basic, like someone's email address, which is already a violation. But in fact, huge swaths of data where people were really opening up about certain kinds of diagnoses, and it was all just leaked. So that's part of the problem when we focus on a kind of data-driven data collection, is it's going to tailor and narrow what's acceptable, which it is already because of insurance and questions of evidence-based care. But also it has, these huge problems in terms of predicting on the grounds of people who are already the most vulnerable to the kind of surveillance, where we see these slides towards capture, and then for many incarceration, carcerality, child protective services, interactions with the state, which are deeply linked. So
Yep.
I'm always very given deep pause. It doesn't mean there aren't people using data effectively in all kinds of ways,
Right.
but they tend to be very aware of how quickly it relates back to, say, policing in
Right.
the United States context.
So I knew a psychotherapist in Boston years ago, trained in a Freudian tradition, who liked to say that psychotherapy is secular pastoral work. And, pastoral work is a really interesting thing because it's outside the economy in a lot of ways. And people take vows so that they can do pastoral work outside the economy. And one of the hidden actors in your story here is the economy and corporations in particular. And one of the things that you show really deftly, I think, toward the back end of the book is how large digital systems open the door precisely to the kinds of surveillance and monetization that you just pointed to. I think we've reached the perfect moment to shift over to the questions that have come in. So I want to keep encouraging folks. I can see the questions that are in chat or in the Q&A, so please use either function. And I'm just going to randomly start, I think, with Adrienne Harris's question. I'll read it for folks who maybe can't see it. Thank you for this deep and fascinating discussion. I have a question about the current, both sudden and immediate acceptance of teletherapy after COVID, when within traditional psychoanalysis, there had been before this crisis, many very prominent figures in psychoanalysis who frankly and explicitly spoke against the use of teletherapy. It's certainly curious, but perhaps more practical than theoretically justified that with COVID, teletherapy is not only acceptable, but valued. It's a curious and dramatic shift, and I'd love to hear your views on this shift.
Thank you so much, Fred, on behalf of...
Yeah, sorry, Adrienne.
No, it's great. I mean, so I think one thing that can happen in folks tuning in to hear about the distance care is that we might have some analysts, but also some people from technology studies or media studies or beyond. So just to back up, the shift, right, was the same shift that everyone in the US kind of and beyond encountered, which is suddenly on March 13th, everyone went tele. And it had happened earlier for colleagues in, China, but also in Italy, where there was a staggering number of deaths early, right in a real center for psychoanalysis in Italy as well, and then here in the US. And it was sudden, it was a rupture, it was traumatic. And also, I think more and more folks had started to do that occasional session on the phone or on FaceTime or on Zoom or on Skype, even if actually legally they weren't supposed to, for a whole host of reasons. One has to do with using habitual media. The other has to do with this huge problem of licensure across state lines that actually always is predicated on the question of suicide and liability, etc. So some people had some experience with carrying the distanced intimacy for a day or a week or even a month of sessions. So folks just kind of made do. Also, I've learned in writing the book that this wasn't the first time everyone shifted over in various communities. So in the 1980s, there was a strike in the New York subway, and folks did phone psychoanalysis for as long as the strike lasted. I was recently told by a colleague, Carl Jacobs in New York, that was really fascinating to hear about, too late for the book. But that to take very seriously, then the mass dramatic shift, yes, people started talking about the value, I think because they had started to practice it. This book is not like either an apology for or an evangelism for teletherapy. Far from it. The story, I think, is much more complicated than that. But one thing it is interested in is extending the reach of care when that actually happens. And this is a case where it did happen, where the work could go on. And a lot of analysts in particular, and I didn't only talk to analysts again, just to say, but reported this kind of return to a feeling of telepathy, either because they were using noise canceling headphones or because they were speaking on the phone instead of on Zoom. And so the patient felt much closer. On the other hand, like many things in the last 18 months, it was a total nightmare. People are taking sessions, both patient and analyst, on the street, in the bathroom, kids crawling through the frame, which is not ideal, so to speak. So I think the question is now on the quote unquote other side, which hasn't happened yet. What about teletherapy was useful for ongoing treatment? versus what was just emergency measure that, like we feel about the university. We're encountering this in academia right now too. What is the push to be back in person versus, stay at distance? People have really good arguments on both sides, and there aren't only two sides. There's more nuance here too.
Yeah, and I think there's a story in the book, and that is paradigmatic for other media moments. I'd like to come back to that in a little bit, but we have two questions that I think are bookends really for each other. And so I'll read them both. One is from Naum and one is from an anonymous attendee. I'll start with Naum's because it came in chronologically first. He says, is there a parallel between the removal of the body in a psychoanalytic context and the removal of a human in telemedicine? I'm thinking of technology, digital assistants, biometrics, substituting for a physician. Maybe people feel they can confide in digital agents and confess symptoms. Can we get better healthcare with something less personal? Then the anonymous attendee, responding to your earlier comment, says, can you talk more about how the role of the therapist as a threat in the same room as the patient changed with teletherapy? Are the gender dynamics a meaningful role? And so I think those two questions speak to each other. And so I turn them both over to you.
Great, thank you. And they really do. So because they are asking, in essence, the same. So start with the threat because it's the particular, right? When there are other threats that are introduced with the digital, right? If this call just dropped right now, I would be totally freaked out. And now, of course, it will happen. Kind of omnipotence, right? Or if Fred's call dropped, we wouldn't really know what to do. Of course, in the middle of the analytic encounter or psychotherapy or CBT, I mean, all of these modes and methods have moved online. That could more or less happen. Or it could be really interesting, right? It might bring up a feeling of being dropped as opposed to being held because the call has literally just dropped. And I deal with this in the coda, which I wrote last summer after the book had been completed way pre pandemic, to think about something called the medium inside, which is how media interact with a kind of psychological early topography. So that dropping might be more or less horrific. And of course, depending on the circumstance. So the threat might no longer be bodily. The analyst who's talking about that is, of course, talking about sexual violence as being a necessary ingredient to a proper psychoanalysis. But we can also water that down, right? That there needs to be some kind of engagement that can only be brought by the body. And I think there are other ways that happens, whether it's digitally or analog media, carry different kinds of threats. On the other hand, so this is to Naum's question, many people do prefer to confide in not even just distantly intimate human to human encounters, but human to not human encounters. That's the whole Eliza phenomenon, right? It's the thing that freaked Weizenbaum out, was that he had assumed that you would need a human to understand human problems. And he argued you do. So you're being played when you give up, anything to a bot. And one thing that's been very horrifying to watch unfold really is the kind of focus not just on depersonalization, which does allow people to confess, but more interesting to me is the fact that that moment of confession has to become enjoyable. That's been a phenomenon I've been tracking, where we need to experience it as kind of giddy and fun and cute, and the kind of deep gamification. It's called like serious games of a certain kind of mental health care, which is a different kind of entrainment. And so, yes, this is exactly what many corporations are betting on, that it's not just the removal of the body, but also the disappearance of deep work that then is fun, that gets you talking about your symptoms, so that you don't have to ever see a human, whether at distance or IRL, as the kids would say.
Yeah, it's I'm looking at the questions. We'll come to those in just a sec. Yeah, it's so interesting. I was thinking about the depersonalization of priests. Before they take communion, they have to be sort of literally, taken out and made not fully human. They're celibate, they're poor in theory. They wear special clothes. And I was also thinking, as you were talking about the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, and thinking about slipping notes to God in between the bricks, and how powerful that can be. Sometimes, there's a sort of prayer tradition that isn't interactive in this way, but that is therapeutic in a related way. Just thinking out loud here. We have some great questions coming in. So Carlin, and apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but Carlin Ejercito asks, where might the racialized division of labor vis-a-vis BPOs in the global South or call center work in the Philippines or India fit in relation to the shift in the gender division of labor you referred to earlier in the discussion? The scholarship on the topic leans heavily on their affective dimension, which seems adjacent in concern to teletherapy, but ultimately doesn't appear to track insofar as customer service isn't quite the same thing.
Thank you so much. So to Carlene's point, right, this story often gets told as and about, you know, the affects of women's labor, and then especially as they're raced and classed, rushing into the office place in the 1970s, when in fact women, especially women of color, have been working all along with their affects, even if those affects become defeminized or desexualized to accommodate the fact that there is a woman present. This is also, you know, it depends very specifically also on global flows and where we're talking. So just contained in the US, teletherapy, right? What I've tracked is that we go from a kind of expert care, you know, whether that's Freud or Winnicott on the radio, to a radical devaluation of the expert. Not radical like a big dropping off, I mean like politically radical, where the idea is, in fact, in the suicide hotline case, no experts, please, because you will pathologize the caller for all kinds of reasons, mostly in the first case having to do with queerness in the 1950s and 60s and the status of homosexuality in the DSM, but also a kind of prevention model that was against suicide, which these hotlines originally weren't. They just were a place to talk. But if you fast forward all the way to 2021, this is the end goal for a lot of the corporations. I've had phone calls and interviews where I quickly refer them to other scholars who actually work, you know, very beautifully on paralinguistic vocal monitoring, like Beth Semmel, to say that this is what they want to bring about, is call centers where, in fact, it is customer service, because there's no expert. You need a human to read the script, and you would want it to be done as cheaply as possible. And so it does begin to follow that story that Carlene is raising, but that's not here yet and now. That's just an aim. Right. And then still we have the problem of licensure and insurance. Right. So bots, in fact, are being used. So it just cuts out towards the kind of automation of work narrative more, which is related but different.
Super interesting. I keep thinking about Tanya Luhrmann's book on the moment when Prozac entered psychotherapy. And, you know, Prozac came with a whole series of understandings about what it meant to be healthy that were also connected to what it meant to be a good worker, to work in an organization. Really interesting. Ellen sorry?
Service with a smile, right?
Service with a smile. Yeah, it's fun to enjoy that smiley moment. I'm still back on Smiley Blanton. I think he's, you know, he's still got the greatest name ever, right? Ellen has a fascinating point, I think, and she says, it occurs to me, especially in light of your last remark about the threat of sexual violence, that the 18th century epistolary novel, especially Pamela, was doing the work of distance therapy. Pamela, quote, cured Mr. B. And what I think Ellen's question opens out onto is something that I've thought a lot about with your book, and it is the ways in which teletherapy and novels both can provide kind of imaginariums within which we can perhaps explore different ways of being. I'm not saying this very well. I sound a little bit like a bad documentary. What I'm trying to get at is how the imaginative experience of reading a novel may or may not be like different modes of teletherapy. And I wonder what you think about that. Does that make sense as a kind of world comparison?
Well, yes, and right. And the and there is just, it's not, you know, what Virginia Woolf says about having written to the lighthouse, that I did for myself what a psychoanalyst might do for the patient. And that leaves therapy. And Woolf is very ambivalent about psychoanalysis, even while publishing the first editions of Freud in English on Hogarth Press. But what she's saying there is that then it's just a kind of cathartic method I did for myself. And I was able to do, or she's saying, and I was able to provide everything in the relational circuit of psychoanalysis as one person. So in the penultimate chapter of the book, I work on a different kind of distanced intimacy, which I call auto intimacy, which is, keeps coming up in all of the questions, whether it's the epistolary novel or why a chatbot, right? Which is what one can do with oneself alone, but in the presence of a quote unquote other, whether that's a novel or Eliza or, some app I have on my iPhone still from research or whatever it is. In the contemporary example, again, that's where that enjoyability, that command to be enjoying it comes from. But there is a much longer history that does definitely begin at least with a written cure, whether that's the epistolary novel or, a French doctor sending out missives from Paris to the countryside. We've been doing cures at distance for ourselves and for other people for centuries.
That's so interesting. A PhD student here recently graduated in French, wrote about letters in the French court and in French salons meant to be read, very intimate, but meant to be performed at the salons so as to create a kind of emotional furor that could then be processed by the group. And it's just fascinating. So John has a terrific question. Just wanted to ask a question about chat or text-based therapy, which is also increasing in frequency now, particularly with youth and young adults. I volunteer for a crisis line in my city and do both phone calls and text-based chats, and completely agree that the medium changes the interaction significantly, both for information gathering, the timing and patterning of responses, how you express yourself, etc. The medium really is the message. And I was just wondering if you had some more comments on this.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And also thank you for volunteering on a crisis line, which is really, really hard work for those who haven't done it. Yes. So I would be really interested to hear from you, but of course, text-based chat is just one level above bot chat in terms of what is automatically derided before we even get going. Because that's the place where definitely there's no silences, there's no intertextuals, there's no face. It's considered the most quote unquote impoverished medium that carries communication. But while that may be true for some, I try and show in my book, starting with that Ask Uncle Ezra example, where's the bridge that everyone jumps off of? Wait, that example just works very well because it might have been a prank, right? We don't have tone. Was it a joke? It's the first missive. And Ezra has to take it seriously because he can't tell. I mean, his name is Jerry Feist. It's not actually Ezra. Ezra is the sort of dad of Cornell, mascot, whatever. And that's a problem with text, but actually at duration, people who work with text discover that they can begin to read the patient into it. So I have another example of a therapist who is treating a patient who is recovering alcoholic who had been drinking, and they could tell that they were slurring their type. Right. So there are these different modes and for connecting. Youth are a whole question because so much is done on text. If we follow Sherry Turkle, we have to take seriously that kids would rather text than talk. And therefore, if they want help, that's going to be the place that they might be more comfortable. And then maybe they'll get on a phone call. But additionally, it's silent, and that can be really powerful and helpful, not only in the prayer sense, but because no one can overhear it. And so we see that also with domestic violence in the case of suicidal ideation, and then especially with youth. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you. And doubling down on the thank you for the work, John. That's really, really terrific and important. Diana has a neat question. So I'll read the whole thing just because it's a cheerful. Congratulations, Hannah. Amazing conversation. I love the throwaway line you gave early in the talk about Freud identifying the right dosage of mediation. It's another example of the amazing way you alter the framework for understanding the therapeutic relationship by just naming and materializing the mediation context. I love that. I just want to repeat that because it's exactly what's going on in the book, naming and materializing the mediation context. How has this awareness of mediation context as a kind of third in a therapeutic interaction and perhaps social interactions writ large, helped you think through your own teaching and speaking engagements over Zoom this year?
That's such a lovely question. Thanks so much, Diana. Um, And it's a hard one too, because I think, and this also speaks to what we're all still living through, right? Fred and I probably are living 90 minutes away with not bad traffic. Some of you are here also in the Bay Area. We're still doing it this way, right? It's not yet safe to gather. And the upside, obviously, is that Diana's on the East Coast and many other people are elsewhere, and you're getting to join. But how has it changed teaching, right? I've tried to think pedagogically about how to convene a kind of appropriately school-based intimate architecture digitally, and that not everything is going to work for everyone, but to try and give a bunch of different options that are, again, not overwhelming. And it's changed in response to pandemic as well as mediation. So I've gotten really basic, following a few friends of mine who work heavily in the keyword tradition. I've turned more to assignments like that also allow for play. And the students have come right along, right? They wrote graduate level keywords on intimacy at distance and social media, starting with John Donne, also with court letters.
Wow.
They were fantastic and blew my mind. But they also made us a Spotify playlist, and they wanted intro and outro music. So really calling on what is rich about this environment, using the chat and, speech and captioning and trying to make an accessible and rich classroom. And just trying, which is really a lot of the story up until we get to the deeply corporate moment of this book, is people trying to meet each other where they are at a distance, which remains the kind of abiding thing I took from my actors, right, is that kind of work. Thank you, Diana.
It's so interesting. We think about the problem of intimacy, and I know this from, metaphysical poetry eons ago. And they were very preoccupied with that. And one of the things that's so lovely about the book is that the problem of intimacy never goes away. The media change, but the problem never goes away. And your attention to it is a kind of warm attention. It's nice. So to Naum, you mentioned Esther Perel, which makes me think of how the romantic landscape has changed with the emergence of dating apps. I confess my mind went there too. I tried experimenting with a romantic AI called Replica. Promise it was an experiment, and it didn't feel different from trying to spark a meaningful conversation on dating apps. Can you or your book weigh in on this strange phenomenon of chat dating and possibly its dehumanizing effects?
And I love the novel long question. That's a great question. So I'm going to do that thing where I punt it to people not in the room. Moira Weigel's book, Labor of Love, and also a great brand new book out from MIT Press, The Politics of Dating Apps. I think, so I'm just going to start by saying there are real great people to ask this question. I've never used one of these apps. I've studied them at distance remove for students who are very interested in this case. But of course, I've had, I was in a long distance relationship with the person I live with now. There are all these kinds of ways of doing the same kind of projection into the phone call, right? Where you invest with like a kind of richness that's something beyond the timbre of your voice, even though, quote unquote, again, it's the impoverished or lesser thing to be at a distance. So whether it's the texting of Tinder, on the other hand, there's of course the dehumanizing affect, which again also has to do with the algorithm, right? Who's considered attractive, what photos scan. That, to my mind, is more like what we get on Twitter, where if you have a mask, in your photo or are not white, automatically your tweets are seen less. And that's also happening on Tinder. And I worry about these things in the more deeply batch processing, quick fixes of the kind of app store that are calling themselves wellness or mental health, but aren't properly therapy. But again, check out those two books because they're great.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things about psychotherapy, and in the Freudian tradition particularly, is that intimacy and desire take place in a really rich, slow context. And some of the ways dating apps work, certainly it's swipe left, swipe right, and you'll find love, and it's like it's the Walmart of love, right? And it's like, well, no, I'll find a bad t-shirt. Yeah.
But I think that that's also just something to say too, is that that speed question is also back to the kind of, the devaluation story that's inescapable when talking about psychotherapy writ large, right? That in World War II, psychoanalysis was seen as the fastest way to batch process patients because Freudian analysts were really good with people returning from the war, precisely because of the attention to the body is speaking, right? The kind of symptom, just as Freud had been pretty good with the quote unquote hysteric patient, again, where the body figures massively, but as a symptom that can be described. And the minute psychoanalysis first meets Prozac, etc. So Jonathan Metzel's work, but then is replaced by it. It's all about how quickly can we get this done. The problem that we've seen is you can get something done really quickly, but it's not going to help long term in any deep or meaningful way.
One of the things that's in your book too is a real STS, science technology studies sensibility about technology. Something that comes through in each of the technologies you describe are the logics of particular historical moments that get built into devices and genres of practice for each of those devices. And I want to close with a question. I'm just going to let myself ask it because I got the microphone and it feels good. But the question is, so imagine you come to this book without a particular interest in the therapeutic part, but with a lot of interest in the tele part. What could somebody who really wants to understand media technology change, its role in historical processes, psychological processes, take away from your book if the cases per se were not critical to their interests?
Well, I mean, and I expect that is going to be, true for some readers, given, again, the devaluation of therapy and also the taboo. Well, part of it is that the book is structured to, it is first and foremost a history of technology and a history of media. And its cases, which I happen to be, of course, very invested in, are about therapy. But right alongside, to Ellen's point, actually to many of the points in the chat, could this have been about the novel? Could this have been about, other works on remote, relationality dating apps? Maybe, because it's very specific, but it gives a kind of litmus test. And that's one of the arguments in the book, is that the therapeutic, leaving aside the fact of what it's doing, is always a kind of artificial encounter with relationality as such, because that's how the work gets done. Even when it's not very good, which is also part of human life. So one thing the book is asking is what kinds of intimacy, again, the good, feel good, or kind of violent kinds of intimacy can be afforded by distance at all across media. And here are some examples of how it's done in therapy. Of course, it's also really a history of psychology too. You'd have to sign on for that a little bit. But these are the hallowed halls of Stanford and MIT and the sort of, Silicon Valley ethos, just as much as it's about Freud writing some letters in Vienna.
Right. And I will also offer that for folks who are interested in media history, therapy is a fabulous case to think through the power of mediation. And I said earlier that one of the things I love about this book is that there are relatively small contained cases, meaning, they're contained in time and space, but they reflect much larger histories. And you can see in the book how these larger historical forces are impacting, infiltrating, and changing therapy through these technologies. And that's really quite an accomplishment. So this is my through the screen high five to you. High five, Hannah. Well done. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Grey Room and to City Lights for hosting the event. It's really been a pleasure. And I know I feel very, very lucky to have been in conversation with Hannah tonight. And I urge you to reach out to folks, to reach out to Hannah, to reach out to me for further contact. And I urge you most of all to order the book. So Hannah, if you'll just stay on for just a second so we can do the logistical stuff. Thank you everyone for being here. Time to sign off. We all have to go off and do other things, but please find the book and continue the conversation. Thank you now.
Thank you.